Ethan Carter's world was built on hard-won peace. A decorated military veteran turned diligent city official, he'd carved out a quiet suburban haven after years of service. His property wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary. In the back of his meticulously landscaped yard lay his pride and joy, a custom-built pool, glimmering in the late afternoon sun. For Ethan, every tile in that pool told a story of resilience and personal freedom. But not everyone in the community shared Ethan's sentiment. Karen Wilkins, the self-appointed HOA's arena, ruled the neighborhood with a reign of petty edicts and a penchant for overreach. As the freshly elected president of the Homeowners Association, Karen was determined to impose her vision of perfection on every resident. On a warm spring afternoon, while Ethan enjoyed a quiet moment by the pool, Karen arrived unexpectedly. Dressed in an immaculate pastel blazer and armed with an oversized clipboard, Karen stepped across the lawn with a haughty air. "Ethan, we need to talk," she announced sharply, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The conversation began innocuously enough. She noted that his pool, despite its obvious craftsmanship, failed to conform to the community standards set forth by the HOA. According to Karen, the pool's privacy fence was insufficient, its design too modern and unorthodox for the neighborhood's traditional aesthetic. Ethan frowned. "I built that pool with my own 2 hands. It's my private retreat," he replied, voice calm but edged with underlying frustration. He had always taken pride in his self-sufficiency, and in the balance he'd struck between personal expression and community harmony. Karen's eyes narrowed as she produced a document. "According to our latest review, your pool's construction violates several clauses of our community guidelines. I'm issuing you a formal notice. You must grant the HOA access for inspection, and you need to retrofit your property immediately," she declared, her tone laced with entitlement. In that charged moment, the stage was set. Ethan's quiet sanctuary was suddenly under siege by an authority he never consented to. The pristine backyard, once a personal Eden, now teetered on the edge of bureaucratic intrusion. Karen's words echoed the collective sentiment of a few board members eager to preserve their vision of conformity, while Ethan's determination to protect his property and his freedom burned even brighter. Their first confrontation crackled with tension. Neighbors peered from behind curtains as Ethan and Karen squared off. To many, it was a clash between a principled homeowner and an overzealous enforcer of arbitrary rules. Ethan, though taken aback by Karen's aggressive tone, felt his resolve harden. "I'm not agreeing to let anyone waltz into my home without cause," he said firmly. Karen's response was icy, as if any dissent was both unexpected and intolerable. "This isn't a request, Mr. Carter, it's an order. The HOA isn't here to negotiate, but to ensure every property reflects the community standards." The conversation ended with no compromise. Ethan retreated into his house with his thoughts swirling, his pool, once a symbol of his independence, now the epicenter of an impending battle against a tyrannical regime. Karen, meanwhile, strutted off, already plotting her next move. The first sparks of conflict had been ignited, and neither was willing to back down. The next morning, Ethan discovered a neatly taped envelope on his front door. Inside was a formal notice, a $750 fine for pool safety noncompliance. The document, emblazoned with the HOA seal, listed multiple infractions ranging from improper barrier height to unapproved pool decor. It was clear that Karen's war on Ethan's private oasis had taken on an official tone. Outside, Karen awaited him on the sidewalk. Her posture exuded smug superiority as she remarked, "You know, Ethan, the rules apply to everyone. I'm simply doing my job." Her eyes glinted with self-righteous satisfaction. But Ethan was no stranger to regulations. He was a city official well-versed in local ordinances. "These fines are baseless," he countered coolly. "Your guidelines contradict city building codes." Without waiting for a reply, Ethan gathered his evidence. Photos of his pool, blueprints approved by city inspectors, and a thick folder of relevant legal documentation. He marched to the local zoning office and filed a formal complaint, knowing that every piece of evidence bolstered his claim. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't idle. Within hours, Ethan noticed the arrival of several inspectors in unmarked vans, their clipboards at the ready. It soon became clear. Karen was pulling every string at her disposal. She had, it seemed, rallied a contingent of anonymous neighborhood complaints about Ethan's property. The inspector's visit was not a neutral review. It was an orchestrated raid aimed at trapping Ethan in an endless cycle of violations. In heated exchanges with the inspectors, Ethan maintained his composure. "I've followed every code to the letter," he explained. But Karen's presence loomed large over every conversation. "I assure you, Mr. Carter, these concerns are not taken lightly," she remarked, her tone dripping with condescension. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted palpably. Neighbors who once admired Ethan's handiwork now whispered warnings or offered furtive glances of sympathy mixed with envy. The fine on his door wasn't just a penalty. It was a declaration of war from an HOA that had grown too comfortable wielding power unchecked. Later that day, as Ethan reviewed the day's events with a trusted friend over coffee, the gravity of the situation sank in. "This is harassment," his friend said, shaking their head. "Karen's just using every legal loophole and municipal connection to intimidate you." Ethan's resolve only hardened. It was no longer just about a pool. It was about standing up against an overreaching bureaucracy that prided itself on conformity at the expense of personal rights. Karen, meanwhile, continued her campaign with relentless determination. Every knock on Ethan's door, every letter delivered, and every unwarranted visit from inspectors was a reminder that the HOA would stop at nothing to bend private property to its will. With a firm grasp on the reins of power and a belief in her own infallibility, Karen seemed convinced that compliance was the only option. But Ethan's quiet defiance, armed with legal acumen and a steadfast belief in his rights, promised that this battle was only just beginning. Ethan soon began to sense a pattern. Karen wasn't content with mere fines and warnings. Rumors swirled among the neighbors, tales of sudden, unexplained violations levied on homes that dared to deviate from the HOA's arbitrary norms. At first, they were hushed whispers. Later, they became overt admissions of discontent. One evening over a backyard barbecue, a longtime neighbor confided, "I've heard that Karen has been marking down minor details as serious offenses just to fill her petty ledger." Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan started his own investigation. He set up discreet cameras around his property and began keeping a meticulous record of every encounter with HOA officials. It wasn't long before he discovered evidence that went far beyond simple regulatory overreach. A fellow board member, anxious and fearful of Karen's wrath, slipped him a note outlining financial irregularities, suggestions that Karen had been channeling HOA funds into personal projects. The evidence was damning. Over several weeks, Ethan compiled video clips of Karen's confrontational behavior and copies of memos that bore the unmistakable stamp of manipulation. His research revealed that several of Karen's so-called violations were fabricated, ghost infractions invented to justify increasing fines and force compliance. Late one night, while reviewing the security footage, Ethan noticed an unsettling trend. On multiple occasions, Karen had appeared at his home unannounced, even after official business was over. At one point, a shot of her furtively scribbling in a logbook sent chills down his spine. "This isn't about community safety, it's about power," he murmured to himself, a resolve crystallizing within him. Emboldened by the mounting evidence, Ethan began to draft a counterattack. He reached out to other affected homeowners, gathering testimonials that confirmed his suspicions. One elderly resident recounted how Karen had previously threatened to seize personal property over a misplaced garden gnome. Another recalled the day Karen had confronted her over the inappropriately positioned recycling bins. Each story added weight to the case that the HOA's rulebook was being manipulated for personal vendettas and financial gain. Karen, sensing the growing opposition, redoubled her efforts. She ramped up the pressure by threatening even sterner measures, eviction notices, property liens, and even hints of a forced sale of homes that didn't conform. At the next board meeting, one that Ethan managed to attend in disguise, the tension was palpable. Several board members exchanged nervous glances as Karen extolled her rights to enforce rules that bordered on the absurd. Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized that this wasn't just a bureaucratic spat. It was a systemic abuse of power. He resolved then and there to expose the corruption not only for his sake, but for the entire community. Every furtive meeting, every dubious fine, every act of intimidation was now ammunition in his quest for justice. That night, beneath the glow of his pool lights, which Karen had previously criticized as too bright, Ethan drafted a plan. He would document every detail, file every complaint, and rally the community against a tyrant who had taken over what should be a safe, private space for homeowners. With the evidence mounting and alliances forming among his neighbors, the battle lines were drawn. Ethan was determined to strike back and reclaim not only his property, but the very principles of fairness and personal freedom that his home embodied. One brisk morning, Ethan awoke to a scene that bordered on surreal. Heavy machinery and a crew of tow trucks were stationed at the edge of his driveway. His pool area was being encroached upon by what Karen declared was an urgent community enhancement project. According to her latest edict, the HOA had the authority to extend sidewalks right through private yards, an assertion that Ethan knew was utterly baseless. Frantic calls and heated texts later, Karen arrived at his door, her face set in a mask of feigned concern. "We're simply preparing for safer, more accessible public spaces," she insisted, gesturing toward the diggers. "Your refusal to cooperate only complicates matters." But Ethan, armed with his meticulously compiled dossier of legal documents and photos of the untouched property boundaries, calmly replied, "There is no legal basis for this. I have every right to maintain my property as it is." At the next HOA meeting, a packed room buzzing with anxious homeowners, Ethan took center stage. Clutching his file of irrefutable evidence, he calmly laid out the case. Every ordinance he complied with, every illegal action taken by the HOA, and every instance where Karen's authority had clearly overstepped. As he presented security footage, snapshots, and official documents, murmurs rippled through the crowd. For the first time, many neighbors began to see Karen's actions not as safeguarding the community, but as an authoritarian power grab. The room fell silent as Ethan detailed how the HOA's enhancements were nothing more than a pretext to exert control. "I've documented every unauthorized entry, every fabricated violation," he declared, voice steady and resolute. "This is not about safety, it's about control. And today, we stand together to reclaim our rights." The confrontation escalated quickly. Karen, visibly rattled by the sudden public scrutiny, attempted to interject with hollow claims of community welfare, but the board members' eyes had shifted. One by one, members of the HOA began to question her narrative, their voices growing stronger with each revelation. Even those who had once been silent supporters now demanded accountability. Outside the meeting hall, the atmosphere was electric. Neighbors discussed their own grievances. Stories of fines levied without notice, warnings delivered in a sneering tone, and visits from inspectors that felt more like interrogations than routine checks. In that charged moment, Ethan's battle had grown far beyond his own property. It was a fight for the soul of the community. Karen's reaction was desperate. With her authority crumbling, she doubled down, issuing a final ultimatum via email, threatening legal action, and even hinting at a personal lawsuit if Ethan continued his defiant behavior. But her threats rang hollow in the face of a united community armed with evidence and the desire for fairness. Ethan's counterattack was measured and resolute. He announced plans to file a class action lawsuit on behalf of all affected homeowners. "We will not be bullied," he told the assembly, his words resonating in the charged silence. "Our homes, our sanctuaries, are not for sale to the highest bidder of conformity." As the meeting adjourned, a sense of vindication swept over the room. Neighbors lingered, discussing how they would finally take back control of their community. Though Karen's face was etched with anger and disbelief, the tide was turning. The HOA's overreach had spurred a rebellion, a collective stand for justice that promised to leave no one behind. Desperation drove Karen to ever more drastic measures. In a final bid to reclaim control, she orchestrated an audacious move. Late one humid evening, as dusk gave way to the neon gleam of streetlights, Karen dialed 911. Her voice trembled with a mix of fury and fear as she reported that Ethan's pool was causing a public disturbance, an allegation so absurd it could only be intended to discredit him. When the police arrived, Ethan met them calmly by his poolside. Flashing his city official badge and presenting his evidence of compliance, he quickly diffused the situation. "There's no danger here," he explained patiently, though the officers exchanged knowing looks at the baseless claim. The incident was recorded on local news, further painting Karen as a figure desperate to maintain her grip through intimidation. Not one to accept defeat quietly, Karen escalated her tactics behind the scenes. Later that week, whispers circulated about her hiring a private investigator to dig up dirt on Ethan, an effort aimed at uncovering any misstep that could be used against him. But fate would have the last laugh. In a stroke of brilliant irony, Ethan's security cameras caught every clandestine move, the PI sneaking around his garage late at night, rummaging through files, and even trying to access Ethan's personal computer. At the following HOA meeting, which had now become a battleground for community justice, Ethan produced the incriminating footage. The screen lit up with scenes of the private investigator creeping through the dark, his actions unmistakably illegal. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the undeniable evidence of Karen's underhanded tactics was displayed for all to see. "This is the final nail in her coffin," Ethan declared. "Not only has she abused her power to harass me, but she's actively employed criminal means to smear my character." The room erupted in outrage. Even longtime supporters of Karen couldn't ignore the damning proof. The board members, now emboldened by the public outcry, began to question every decision she'd ever made. Karen's face turned ashen. In that moment, her carefully constructed facade crumbled before the eyes of the community. No longer could she hide behind the guise of community interest, when her actions spoke only of personal vendetta and blatant corruption. Desperate and isolated, she tried to shout over the murmurs of disbelief, "I'm doing what's best for all of you." But her words fell on deaf ears. As the meeting drew to a close, the board voted to launch an independent investigation into her conduct, and several members demanded her immediate suspension pending the outcome. Ethan, though exhausted by the prolonged battle, felt a surge of vindication. His methodical gathering of evidence and unwavering stand had finally exposed the rotten core of the HOA leadership. Karen's final, desperate move had backfired spectacularly. The police report, the incriminating security footage, and the growing chorus of homeowner testimonies all converged to make it clear. Her reign of intimidation was over. The community had seen through the charade, and the battle for justice was shifting irreversibly in favor of those who believed in fairness and the sanctity of private property. In the days that followed, the tide turned swiftly. With the damning evidence against her now in the open, the community's anger coalesced into a powerful force. Homeowners, previously cowed by Karen's arbitrary fines and legal threats, united in a show of solidarity. At a specially convened town hall meeting, the atmosphere was electric with resolve. Ethan led the charge, presenting a clear timeline of abuses, financial irregularities, and blatant overreaches by the HOA. "We deserve transparency and respect," he declared, his voice resonant in the packed community center. "No one should live in fear of a person who abuses power." One by one, affected neighbors recounted their own harrowing experiences, from absurd fines to threats of eviction. Their stories interlocked to form an undeniable mosaic of injustice. Under mounting pressure, the city officials launched a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. The investigation revealed that Karen had not only violated the community's trust, but had also been misappropriating funds for personal luxuries. In a swift act of retribution, the city levied substantial fines against the HOA, effectively forcing a financial reckoning. In a climactic vote, the homeowners demanded Karen's immediate removal from office. With the majority of the board siding against her, Karen was forced to resign in disgrace. The once feared enforcer of arbitrary rules found herself publicly humiliated. The very property she'd so zealously guarded from improper changes, her own house, was put on the market overnight by panicked board members scrambling to distance themselves from her misdeeds. Ethan, though battle-scarred, felt a quiet triumph as he sipped his morning coffee by the pool, a symbol of his reclaimed autonomy. The HOA that had once been the instrument of her tyranny was now being reformed under a new, more transparent leadership. The community's collective voice had prevailed. A formal press conference later that week encapsulated the moment. Local news cameras captured the proud smiles of once silent residents, while Ethan stood as a testament to perseverance against institutional overreach. "This is not just my victory," he said, "but a victory for every homeowner who has ever felt oppressed by arbitrary rules." His words resonated far beyond the neighborhood boundaries, inspiring other communities grappling with similar abuses. Karen's downfall was complete. Isolated and discredited, she vanished from the community scene almost overnight. Even her personal assets began to crumble. Rumors of repossession and pending legal actions circulated among former allies. In the aftermath, the community set about rebuilding trust in their HOA, with a renewed emphasis on fairness, transparency, and accountability. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. The long struggle had taken its toll, but the sense of empowerment was undeniable. The pool, the very heart of his property, remained untouched, a silent monument to his tenacity. With the HOA in ruins and a new chapter unfolding, Ethan looked forward to quieter days ahead, confident that justice had finally been served. In the wake of the community uprising, legal repercussions began to cascade. Local authorities, spurred by mounting public pressure, initiated a series of lawsuits against the HOA. Investigations uncovered not only Karen's misuse of funds, but also widespread procedural violations that rendered the entire association's leadership questionable. Ethan, serving as a reluctant community spokesperson, helped organize a class action lawsuit. Neighbors gathered evidence, documented testimonials, and joined forces to reclaim what had been stripped away from them: their right to live without intimidation. "This is about accountability," Ethan insisted at a community forum, "and ensuring that no one else is ever subjected to such tyranny." Within weeks, the city imposed severe fines on the HOA, and several board members were summoned for questioning. The legal fallout was swift and merciless. Contracts were voided, and the association's governing documents were declared null in certain respects. For many, it was a long overdue reckoning with a system that had thrived on secrecy and coercion. As the lawsuits gained momentum, media outlets began to cover the unfolding drama, further pressuring local officials to act decisively. The resulting legal verdicts not only dissolved the corrupt elements within the HOA, but also paved the way for a reformed democratic system, where homeowners had a real voice. Ethan's final power move wasn't one of revenge. It was a steadfast commitment to restoring justice and fairness to his community. With the HOA in legal disarray, Karen's personal life unraveled just as precipitously. Once the face of authority, she now became a cautionary tale of entitlement gone awry. Public records and media exposés revealed a cascade of personal misfortunes. Her car was repossessed for unpaid fines. Her marriage, built on a foundation of shared complicity in her schemes, crumbled under the weight of scandal, and she was forced to leave the very neighborhood she had once controlled. In a final twist of poetic justice, Ethan encountered Karen unexpectedly at a community job fair. She was seeking employment as an assistant property manager for another HOA. The sight was almost surreal. The once imperious Karen reduced to scrambling for a paycheck, her confident air replaced by forced meekness. With a quiet smile, Ethan remarked, "I hope you like following the rules." His words, though measured, carried the weight of a community freed from her oppressive grip. The neighbors watched with a mixture of vindication and relief as Karen's influence evaporated. Her downfall wasn't just personal. It was emblematic of the community's rejection of abusive power. What had begun as an overreach in the name of community standards had become an enduring lesson in accountability and civic engagement. In the months that followed, the neighborhood found its rhythm once again. The air was lighter, conversations more genuine, and the once ominous presence of the HOA replaced by a cooperative spirit of shared responsibility. Ethan's pool, once the battleground of a bitter conflict, now shimmered peacefully under the summer sun, a symbol of personal triumph and reclaimed freedom. On one particularly warm afternoon, as neighbors gathered for an impromptu barbecue, laughter and light-hearted banter filled the yard. Amid the conviviality, someone jokingly presented Ethan with a fabricated HOA violation notice for having an excessively inviting pool. Ethan held the paper aloft and chuckled, replying, "They really tried, didn't they?" His smile said it all, a quiet, knowing satisfaction that justice had been served, and that the tyranny of entitlement was a thing of the past. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, the scene grew tranquil. Neighbors lingered over shared memories of the past months, a time marked by strife, resistance, and ultimately, renewal. Ethan sat back on his porch, his gaze drifting over the pool that had once been the focus of so much conflict, now a beacon of serenity and community resilience. In that final reflective moment, it was clear that the community had not only reclaimed their rights, but had also rediscovered the true meaning of home, a place where every individual's voice mattered, and where justice, though hard-fought, was ultimately attainable. The legacy of Karen's reign would fade into a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of standing up against overreach. The screen of community life had shifted from one of intimidation to one of mutual respect and accountability. And as the night deepened, the echo of Ethan's quiet victory, both personal and communal, lingered like a whispered promise that no one would ever again allow entitled power to dictate the sanctity of their home.